Chapter 2. Peppercorn. The boy awoke cold and wet. He had slept only fitfully, if truth be told. At first it had been the general discomfort of lying on a hard wooden floor, shivering beneath a thin blanket that had kept sleep at bay. Then it was the thunder and the lightning of the storm, rolling ominously across the lake, stabbing his eyes with bright flashes of light that had kept him from sleeping. The wind, which in the small hours had gone through him like a razor, had only added to his discomfort, and then it had been the wetness of his clothes keeping him awake, once the rainwater had begun to run along the planks and walkways beneath the bridge where he had sheltered for the night. He had begun the night swaying violently in his hammock aboard the Farthing, but on nights like this only a fool would risk remaining on the water. Not even the protective walls of the haven could guarantee the safety of the ships at berth once the lake was churning with the storm, so the boy and his crew had sought the scant refuge and safety of the porter's bridge. Peppercorn was the boy's name, or at least Peppercorn was what people called him. Peppercorn, or else Pepper for short, or sometimes just Pep. He was a boy of roughly 12 or 14 years. No one knew for sure. It was not really important. But he was a boy of Laketown, and he was of that lowly and impoverished breed that was often categorised as urchin or wharf waif, what some in Laketown called a gull, meaning a scavenger and an opportunist, one who lived by his wits and what others left unattended. This classification was in Peppercorn's case a little unjust, for though he did indeed come from the ranks of the poor and unpropertied, he was an ambitious and industrious young man whose assiduity led him only infrequently into those murky realms of criminality that one of his degree might have been expected to inhabit. True, he'd had his brushes with the provost men and the watch, had dabbled betimes in a little smuggling, but he'd resolved to avoid repeating that dubious privilege after having his ears boxed violently and his cargo confiscated, a cost which he'd had to bear himself. Peppercorn had risen early, before the other shapeless piles of dirty blankets and rags that were his companions had bestirred themselves. They were each one orphans. Some claimed to have parents, though Peppercorn had seen precious little evidence of them, and if parents did exist, they wanted no part of their offspring, that was for sure, nor the responsibility of feeding or housing them either. He stepped from under the bridge to find the storm was now nothing more than a fine drizzle, but he knew the calm would not last. It was merely the weather drawing breath after the ravages of the night, and it would be raining and blowing again before mid-morning. A daunting thought, considering the fact that he would be spending the time betwixt now and then on Grubb's fishing boat, being tossed to and fro on the churning lake. It was on days like this that fellows lost their footing on a slippery deck, or stumbled on a coil of carelessly stowed rope and found themselves overboard, lost upon the lake, never seen or heard of again. With this thought uppermost in his mind, he made his way along the rain-slicked towpath that edged the canal, up steps and over bridges, past homes that were still asleep, their windows shuttered and their chimneys not yet smoking, through the part of the city called the Sinistral, near the guardhouse and the felon's gate. He was not the only one up and about at that unnatural hour, far from it. Passing by the open workshop of Husk Iron-Tongs the blacksmith at Furnace End, Pepper saw the boy, Hammer, busying himself around the forge, working at the bellows to breathe new life into the smoking coals of the furnace. I say boy, but Hammer was at least as old, if not a little older than Peppercorn himself. Having grown up working alongside the blacksmith, tirelessly pumping the bellows and striking at the anvil, he was as strong as most men and stronger than many. Of course, Hammer was not the boy's real name, not his given name, though what that had been was now long forgotten. He had been apprenticed to the blacksmith at the age of 5, from which age he had begun to respond to the blacksmith's outstretched hand and cries of "Hammer!" And so often was the word shouted at the boy that soon it was the only name he responded to. He and Peppercorn had been on friendly terms for many years, but the work of a blacksmith's apprentice, not to mention a deckhand on a fishing boat, did not allow much time for extending friendships beyond the odd civil word. On occasion, when the blacksmith was away from the smithy on some errand, Hammer would sometimes allow Pepper and his boys to come in from the cold of a winter's day, to warm themselves beside the glowing embers of the forge, which, even at rest, glowed with inner warmth. Looking up briefly from his work, Hammer nodded a silent greeting, which Peppercorn returned with a smile as he hurried on by. Crossing over Kelling's Span, the bridge that went west to east beside the tannery, Peppercorn looked down to see old Diesel in his small boat, punting a large beech log up the canal back to his workshop in the Sinistral. There it would be sawn and split and riven, and turned upon his pole laid into bowls, platters, mazers, and porringers. There was hardly a soul in Laketown who did not daily eat their meals from one of old Diesel's bowls or with one of his wooden spoons, except that is those who could afford pewter or even silver for their tableware. "Good morning, Master Diesel," Peppercorn called down as he passed overhead. Looking up to see who hailed him so affably, the old man smiled. "'Tis a better morning than it was a night, Pepper," and then added, "and all preserve us." Though Peppercorn put little stock in the good man's blather of gods and miracles, he called down the customary reply of "Let it be so," and continued on his way toward the postern. Passing by the assizes, Peppercorn came across a team of workmen, 5 or 6 in number, huddled about a small brazier of glowing coals upon which a kettle boiled and a frying pan sizzled and spat with thick slabs of bacon. Peppercorn could see that the men had removed a section of the walkway on the southern side of the canal, prizing out iron nails from rotten timbers, and were going to spend the day replacing them with new planks of hewn and sawn ash, but not before they had some breakfast and a cup of tea to set them up for the morning. With the smoky smell of frying bacon strong in his nostrils, twisting somewhat his empty belly, Peppercorn continued his journey eastward. A drift of swans caught his eye, white against the black waters, scudding effortlessly upon the still water, gliding majestically under bridge and arch. It was not unusual to see water birds, swans, ducks, and coots, who had found their way into the city when it was locked and barred to all other traffic, busy about their morning meanders, unconcerned by the punts and skiffs that moved about them. On Sparrow Lane, Pepper passed Thrin the potter on his way to Bilge Wharf at the Troll Gate, where he was to collect some red clay. Thrin was a good man who, despite having very little of anything for himself, was always happy to share what he did have, and Peppercorn and his boys had oft had a share of his meal when nothing else could be found. Many a time, Pepper had noticed, leaving the old man with nothing for himself. Peppercorn walked with the old potter for as far as their paths were the same, and carried the large tub in which Thrin would carry the heavy clay all the way back to his workshop. To the south, the temple bells were sounding across the city rooftops, calling citizens from their beds, ringing in the new day and reminding all of their duty to Anor. The good men, he knew, would be about their prayers and anxiously encouraging others to do likewise. The ringing grew to a crescendo as they approached, and then passed beneath the hill, with its towers and grand buildings looming overhead, casting their way now in shadow. Pepper had at times done a spot of begging along here, on days when things had looked particularly bleak, and it seemed there was nothing else for it. He would sit with begging bowl, either on the stairs or else the public landings outside the temple or the monument. And though he might get the odd farthing, or halfpenny even, it was often accompanied with a measure of disdain and disapproval. The wealthier citizens of Laketown, those who dwelt in the large households of the weft, and who travelled to the temple each morning in private skiffs, accompanied by liveried servants, did so in order not to have to mix with the likes of Peppercorn, the poor and lowly, the sick and starving. And though they might not begrudge the odd copper coin, they certainly did not want reminding that his kind existed, thank you very much. It left a bad taste in the mouth, no doubt, and ruined the sanctity of their morning prayers. He was never there for long, mind you, before he was chased away by the watch, whose job it was to keep the streets and public places free of such nuisances and ne'er-do-wells. Peppercorn and Thrin continued east together, coming into the postern at Derrick's Bridge, and continued toward the city gates until they came to a large building, a kind of warehouse near the marketplace at Jedd's Harbour, over which hung a large painted sign that read in the common tongue, "Laidlaw and Sons, Traders." Here Thrin took back the tub, and he and Peppercorn parted ways with a friendly farewell. Rapping a somewhat impatient tattoo upon the main door of the Laidlaw and Sons building, Peppercorn fidgeted from one foot to the other while he waited for his knocking to be answered. And he did not have to wait for long before the door was opened by a ruddy-faced woman of middle years, in the process of drying her hands, the hands of someone who had performed much work over their lifetime, upon an apron which was tied tightly around her generous waist. She was coated in a fine dusting of white flour and swathed in a wonderful aroma of fresh baking that further twisted at Peppercorn's empty stomach. "Got this for the skipper's breakfast," said the boy, producing a butterflied kipper from his pocket, though all the time unable to take his mind off of the mouth-watering aroma of fresh bread that seemed to wash over him from the open door. "Smoked it myself, I did. You won't find its like in the whole of Laketown, and certainly not its equal." The woman knew this was not true. Smoked fish were 10 a penny in the market, but she was content to pay the boy for his fish, as she did whenever he came a-calling, and pay him over the odds for the pleasure. He was a good boy, and she wished she could do more for him, but he was stubborn and determined to be independent of her motherly instincts and the skipper's charity. Besides, she had 7 boys of her own, and Anor knew that was more than enough trouble without adding orphans to the number. Pepper had lived here for a time at the Roost with the Laidlaws. It was the missus who had once called their home the Roost, saying it was where she and her chicks nested, and the name had stuck. The missus and the skipper and their 7 sons, and he had been happy in a manner of speaking, but a house that full leaves very little room for growing, either of limbs or ambitions. But there was something about the boy, something that endeared her to him. Perhaps it was the rosy blush that sat always upon his golden cheeks, that deepened with exertion and flushed with embarrassment. Or perhaps it was his unquenchable lust for life that made her want to look after him, to mother him and take care of him. And yet, was he not surrogate parent himself to a gaggle of waifs and strays, as devoted as any mother or father, and him barely more than a child himself? I don't know why you insist on sleeping under sailcloth and beneath bridges, she chided, as she had 100 times before, looking him up and down, and noting with a tut the wetness of his clothing, patched and worn as they were. You know the skipper and me would find a little space for you here if you wanted. I doubt you would take up much room. Here, she added in a conspiratorial whisper, have one of these for yourself and take the rest for your crew, and handed him a single bread roll, golden topped and still warm from the oven, and a dishcloth that had been knotted around another 5. It made Peppercorn smile to hear how she stressed the word crew, as if she were playing along with a child's game of make-believe. They're fresh this morning and still piping hot. You're too kind, missus, but I'd no sooner abandon my boys than you would your own. The missus knew this to be true. If Peppercorn was anything, this street boy, this lowly orphan, it was loyal, and he took seriously his responsibility to those who had come to depend upon him. Well, if you can't bring yourself to stay here, Pep, with the skipper and me, you could always go to the good men, when the weather turns at least. They'd put a roof over your head, I wouldn't doubt. Peppercorn screwed up his face at the mention of the good men. I don't trust them, missus. Their words may sound fair, but their ways seem foul. I worry at what they would want in exchange for any charity they might give, always trying to save my soul and such like. He had of course tried the beneficence of the good men once before, but never again, not if he could help it. On that occasion he had spent hours upon his knees on the golden steps of the temple, praying and meditating, they had called it, contemplating his fallen and worthless state, and all before they'd give him a spot on the floor beneath the portico for the night. Not inside the temple, you understand, where he might have found a dry corner and maybe a small hearth to warm himself, but outside under the porch. Didn't give him so much as a morsel to eat, nor a blanket neither. No, he wouldn't trust the good men again. Oh, he'd go up to the temple on feast days maybe, when there was the chance of a little free food, but he would never again ask for alms of them. His poor knees couldn't take it. Can't say as I blame you, the missus agreed. Never could abide them myself. Too much preaching and praying for my liking. But look you here, Pep, she told him, pressing a small coin into his hand. You take care out on that lake today. The weather's set to be filthy, and I don't want to hear how you came to a sticky end, being pitched overboard for the sake of a net full of herring, you hear? You've no need to worry on my account, missus, said Peppercorn, tucking the coin into his waistband as he set off once more along the walkway. 'Twill take more than a spot of rain to put pay to me, he called back over his shoulder. I dare say you're right, sighed the missus, more to herself than to the urchin boy, since he was already halfway down the walkway, heading toward the quay where the fishing boats were berthed. The small coin Peppercorn had needed to pay Nodnell the tailor for Ha'penny's food and lodging. Ha'penny was not Pepper's sister, no more than all the orphan boys who had huddled beneath the bridge that night with him were his brothers. No more, indeed, than were the skipper and the missus his parents, or their 7 sons his own kith and kin. No, she was no sister to Peppercorn, but that didn't mean to say he hadn't claimed her as his own. Now 8 or 9 years of age, Ha'penny had been but a babe when her parents had died, leaving her alone in the world, and so it was Peppercorn who had cared for her ever since, bringing her at first into the Laidlaw's kitchen to share his crate and food. Peppercorn made sure that Ha'penny would not add her name to the tally of those gone over to Anor's side. Ha'penny did not live beneath bridges, not any more, leastways. For the past 2 years or so she had dwelt on the top floor of Nodnell's shop, in a space beneath the roof. She was all of 6 years old when she was taken on as seamstress. Of course, back then she knew nothing of needles or threads, thimbles or embroidery hoops, nor did she know split stitches, stem stitches or satin blocks. Now she knew many and more of the intricate and delicate stitches that ladies liked to have of their garments, and could produce them quickly and carefully. Still, she was not yet paid for her labour, her work paid only for the privilege of learning from the master and a blanket beneath the eaves of his draughty house. One day, Nodnell would pay her for her work, to be sure, but for now, though her stitches were as small and neat as anyone's, and though her work was in great demand by those who frequented Nodnell's establishment, until she was herself a needlewoman and a journeyman seamstress, the guild insisted that she pay her master for her apprenticeship. Just one more responsibility that Peppercorn had taken on himself. Halfpenny had always been a favourite of the missus, who delighted in those rare occasions when, given a half-day off, she came to visit. For though she loved and doted upon her sons, she did say that a girl in the house brought a certain liveliness that was otherwise missing. "I expect you boys to each give me little girl grandchildren once you wed hatching chicks of your own," she would instruct every time Halfpenny had left, taking her mirth and froth with her. "That goes for you too, Pep," she had added with a note of reproof, even though he had long ceased being resident at the roost. But all that would keep, and Nodnell would have to wait too for now. If Peppercorn were to crew aboard Grubb's boat, he would have to make haste to the postern, for the fishing fleet shipped early each morning. His own nets had drawn very little for the past 3 days, and the kippered herring he had sold for the skipper's breakfast was in fact the last of his fish. There was nothing else for it. If he did not want to starve, nor condemn Halfpenny and his boys to a similar fate, he would have to crew for Grubb. Peppercorn had done it many times before. Once more would not hurt. There were worse ways of earning a crust, he knew that. Still, it irked him to have to crew another man's boat when his own sat idly at berth, or to labour for another man's profit when his own purse was empty, and it irked doubly so to have to work for one as detestable as Grubb. Still, at least doing it this way, the risk was all Grubb's, and his wage was guaranteed whether they hauled fish or no. But there was one more stop he would make, as he did most mornings on his way to the harbour. It was in Randall's yard, a single-room dwelling, no bigger than a cupboard really, pinched between two much taller, larger buildings, a metalworker's and a pie and pasty shop. It had no windows and was closed off at the front with only a curtain of sailcloth, which served to keep out all but the strongest of winds while holding in the smoke from the small brazier, the only luxury to speak of within the tiny home. Though meagre in size and facilities, it was indeed a home, belonging to, or at least inhabited by, an old man, well past his years of useful employ, and forgotten or ignored by most of those amongst whom he lived. He dwelt there alone, and was known by those few who cared as Pabby. Drawing back the heavy curtain, Peppercorn revealed from the darkness within a jumble of blanket and humanity, ragged and soiled, that seemed to writhe into life beneath the light that parting the curtain admitted. It was hard to make out any distinguishable detail until a single hand thrust out from the gloom, pale of skin, blue-veined and bony, its nails blackened and torn. Peppercorn placed the still warm bread roll that the missus had given him into the claw-like hand, and, without a word, it was quickly withdrawn and the curtain let fall. It was but a short distance from Randall's yard to the harbour, walking as he was at a quick pace. It meant passing through the postern, the easternmost quarter of the city, where already men and women busied themselves amid the various market squares, sweeping away the previous day's debris and making preparation for the arrival of the fish that would come with return of the fleet, not to mention the many customers who would be jostling and haggling for the best catch at the lowest price. As he hurried toward the city's easternmost limit, a woman with a pony cart, piled as high as it was long with wooden boxes, barrels and crates of vegetables from South Harbour, trundled past him and across the wooden boardwalk. It was also here, at the quarter's furthest limit, that the Troll Gate, the main fishing port, and the Seine Gate, the old fishing port, opened out onto the great expanse of the lake, and it was here that Peppercorn headed. There were berths all along the wharf, with a good many boats in a forest of masts that rose and fell on the still unsettled water of the lake. Jetties ran out from the wharves along the length of the harbour like the teeth of a comb, and fishing boats of all shapes and sizes were moored by hempen ropes on either side of each jetty, where men from the various crews busied themselves up and down gangplanks in preparation for setting sail. These were the boats of the fishing fleet, doggers and ketches, small boats with but one or two sails, with swollen barrel-like hulls, all the better for holding as big a catch of flounder and herring as could be managed, or as Anor might bless them with. And each boat was named. There was the Grub Stake, Toil's Fancy, the Grist Mill, the Price of Success, the Fail Me Not, the Constant Striving, to name but a few, all earthy names that reflected the fickle nature of the fisherman's fortunes, not to mention the hardness of his life and lot. Peppercorn's own little boat, the Farthing, was moored in the opposite direction, against one of the southernmost jetties, but he would not be captain in her until the morning's work was finished. It was not an ideal arrangement, for in the afternoon, when he and his small crew were free to venture back out onto the lake, the fish swam down to the bottom beyond the reach of his old net, leaving them with very little left to catch. No, the early morning was the best time to haul the biggest catch, but the early morning belonged to grub. The skies here above the harbour thronged with the piercing cries of seabirds anxious for breakfast. There were larger gulls and terns with bright beaks and legs that flashed brightly through the sky, and black-headed gulls that watched from their perch atop the sail spars of the bobbing boats, their bodies smooth white and pebble grey, their beaks and faces black as if they had been dipped like a quill into a well of ink. Peppercorn hailed Scoggins, the harbour master, who sat, as he always did, beneath a sailcloth lean-to beside a small brazier, a pipe lolling unlit in his toothless mouth. "Morning, Master Scoggins," he called over the noise of the squabbling gulls. "I see you survived the night, then." "Ay, I did at that, Pep, though I couldn't but notice you found yourself a nice little cranny away from the water. Don't blame your mind, it's awful dark and cold down yon." And so saying, he pointed into the black water with the stem of his pipe. Peppercorn stood for a moment, as he did each day, as he had every day for as long as he could remember, oblivious to the hustle and bustle of the busy fishing docks that carried on their business around him, to breathe in the cold, fresh smell of the lake. Not the brackish smell of scum and stagnation, mind, the filthy stench that seemed to pervade the canals and causeways of the city, but the wild and watery smell of the living lake. Path Ned Lawn, that's what the ancients had called the fishing grounds of the Long Lake. It meant the fields of the water, for the folk of Laketown did indeed labour over and harvest the waters in much the same way as any farmer harvests his fields. You see, to the people of Esgaroth, the lake was everything. It was north and south as far as the eye could see. It was the eastern horizon. The only proof that they were not on an island in the middle of the endless ocean was the line of trees to the west that marked the beginning of Mirkwood Forest, but that could only be seen from the Sallyport or atop the monument. The lake truly was the lifeblood of Laketown. It was mother and father, friend and foe. It was there from birth to grave. It brought life and it brought death. There was a long and proud tradition of fishing the depths of the Long Lake, and these tub-like boats were the pride and prized possessions and the mainstay of many of the poorer Laketown families. When the lake blessed them with its bounty, then were they satisfied and content, but when the lake withheld its abundance, then hard times struck at the fortunes of all those with a stake in the fishing boats. And that was tough, but not half as bad as it was for those without family, those who couldn't care for and provide for themselves, who relied upon those more resilient and resourceful types like Peppercorn, who could. And were it not for Peppercorn, for his compassionate heart and sense of responsibility, many of those waifs who had slept beneath the bridge near Bennett's Lock, wrapped beneath the ragged blankets that Peppercorn had provided for them, their bellies, if not full, then at least content with the food he had acquired for them. As I say, many would by now have slipped unnoticed and unmourned from this life. They were his boys, his crew, his responsibility. He had taken it upon himself some years ago. Though he had no home nor family of his own, he had the skipper, which gave him some stability at least, something to fall back on when times got hard and things were a little thin. And with the skipper and the missus to catch him when he fell, he felt it was his responsibility to help those without such a safety net. Having nothing in the world besides that which they wore or carried, which was next to or as good as nothing, you would think they were used to having nothing and would be satisfied when Providence supplied them with just a very little. But not these boys. These were growing boys. These were hungry boys, always hungry, and when food came they fell upon it and devoured it with relish. But it was never enough, and they were always left unsatisfied, capable of eating more. And so began the search once more, and when they didn't search for food, they searched for work, just enough to earn them enough for the next meal or two. The skipper had found Peppercorn the apprenticeship aboard the Bitter Hope when he was the age of 8 years or so, give or take a year. The missus had not exacted this labour of him. She would willingly have provided for him amongst her own brood, but from a young age Peppercorn had insisted on paying his way, and from a young age he'd had but one dream, to have a boat of his own. His first boat he had made from a shallow ale firkin, around the top of which he had strung a row of old cork floats for buoyancy, and had rigged a simple mast with an old piece of oilcloth for a sail. It had leaked terribly, and being round in shape was nigh on impossible to steer, but he had loved it all the same. He had longed for his own boat, and to this end had bent all his efforts. And now he had one, the Farthing. It was only a small boat, smaller than all the others moored at the postern. A small cuddy at the rear served as both berth for the captain and offered a little shelter to the tillerman. A hatch in the foredeck gave access to the below decks, both for storage and crew hammocks. A single mast and crossmember allowed for a single sail, and flew a swallow-tailed flag that the missus had sewn for Peppercorn, depicting a small bird, a feisty little wren, its tail raised defiantly, a representation, so she had said, of Peppercorn himself. Peppercorn had worked hard and saved hard to be able to buy it. The skipper had pulled a few strings to his advantage, and though it was patched and worn and had had many owners before him, it was his own, and he was very proud of it. Peppercorn had not always earned his crust on the fishing boats. When younger, he had engaged in employment more suitable to his age and size. Betimes he had tried his hand at cockling in the rock pools by the Chancellor's Gate, and if he was lucky he would uncover a red rock crab or two. In the summer months he had waded in the black mud at the lake's bank, rooting in the ooze and muck for discarded or lost treasures, anything of worth that might wash up at the shoreline, the odd copper coin perhaps, or a cloak pin. More often than not, all he found was a pipe with a broken stem, or else a knife that had lain beneath the water till it was naught but rust in a bone handle. But the mud was so icy cold, even at that time of year, that his limbs would soon turn numb, and his joints swelled so painfully that he could not keep it up for more than an hour or so at a time. For a while he had gone house to house each morning with a bucket to collect night soil that he would sell to the tanners on Hemlock Row. One day he would not have to work for grub, or anyone else for that matter. One day he would captain his own fishing boat and earn a living for himself and for his crew. But that day was still a long way off, little more than a pipe dream really, for the farthing was no fat-bellied fishing cog who was not suited to trawling a fishing net or storing baskets of fish in its hold, not to mention the fact that he had but one fishing net, a small, well-used one that was more hole than string, and had seen many previous owners and better days. Deep in these thoughts he was soon brought back to the job at hand by the sound of heavy boots upon the wooden wharves. Already the provost men were busy about the harbour. Peppercorn recognised Larkin amongst their number, a young boy of roughly his own age who was apprenticed to the provostman's office, and who was usually a little kinder and fairer in his dealings. He recognised also the familiar figure of Master Breakwater, the proctor, most senior amongst the provostmen of the postern, who was the antithesis of Larkin's even-handedness, and loathed of the fishermen of Laketown. The provostmen were easy to spot, for they wore surcoats of royal blue, bearing the devices of a golden portcullis upon the breast, liveries that marked them out as provostmen, also a hooded short cape of the same hue that just covered their shoulders, except for in Larkin's case, for his short cloak, made as it was for one with a grown man's stature, came down below his waist, making it not such a short cloak, and each one was armed with a heavy blackthorn club. Larkin or no Larkin, still Pepper was happy to avoid the provost men. Why court trouble, he thought to himself, if it can be avoided? They were usually on the hunt for bribes at this time in the morning, captains content to give up a coin or two in order to avoid being delayed getting out onto the water, or for assurances of preferential treatment on their return. Since Larkin and his fellow officers were on the boats to his right, Peppercorn was glad to be turning northward along the wharves to the jetty marked with a red ring, painted upon a weather-worn board. Here the Bitter Hope was moored, as she always was, alongside the Sorrow for Sins and the Slave's Wages, while opposite lay the Keep Trying and the Beast of Burden. A little further along the quay, a group of boat hands were gathered about a charcoal brazier, cooking small fish for their breakfast over the glowing coals. The smell was tantalising and twisted Peppercorn's empty stomach. Realising how hungry he was, for he had not eaten since the previous morning, he wished he had the wherewithal to buy just one of the tiny fish. But for now, breakfast would have to wait until he had returned and gone out once more on his own boat, the Farthing, to catch some fish of his own. That's when he saw his boys. They were all there, in body if not yet in spirit, Dimmock, Nickel, Crescent, Giles and Baldwin Piecrust, and they shambled down the quayside, still half asleep by the look of them, their blankets rolled and slung across their backs. Peppercorn smiled to see how they laughed and teased and jostled each other playfully as they came along the landing, as if they hadn't a care in the world, when in truth all they had was cares, and never a possession between them but the holes in their pockets. They were so much more than just his crew. They were his friends, his family, his brothers. Heavens knew, at times they were his children. He certainly felt they were his responsibility, and did what little was within his powers to protect and provide for them, just as the skipper had done for him when he was younger, and they in turn gave him their loyalty. They in turn were glad to see Peppercorn, and they chatted briefly, commenting on the violence of the storm of the previous night. They were especially glad to see the Mrs. Bread rolls. They each took one and ate it hungrily, none of them noticing that Peppercorn hadn't got one for himself. Breakfast and small talk finished, they split up and went their several ways, some to one fishing boat, some to another. Dimmock would sail with Master Bain on the slave's wages, Nickel with Abe on the Fail Me Not, Crescent and Giles would sail with bearded Rollon on the Beast of Burden, whilst Peppercorn and Baldwin made their way to the Bitter Hope. "Where have you been, sluggards?" Group asked in his nasal whine as the two boys stepped onto the deck of the fishing boat. "At this rate, we'll be lashed out of the harbour, and all the fish will be in baskets before our nets are even wet." Peppercorn made no reply. He knew Grubb did not expect his questions to be answered. Accustomed as he was to his captain's berating, he thought it best to bide his tongue and get on with his work. Grubb was not a fair man, nor was he open-handed or honest. If he could squeeze an extra penny from a basket of fish, he would. If he could sell 9 fish for the price of 10, he would. If he could exact a day's work out of a man for half a day's pay, he would. And if he could get away with having only 2 men to do the work of 3 or 4, he would. If you took a day's pay from Grubb, then you were expected to put in at least a day's work. No allowances were made for the age or size or strength of a person, and that made Grubb a hard master and one who expected more back than he gave. Peppercorn had known this from the very first day he had stepped foot aboard the Bitter Hope, but what could he do? He could not go elsewhere, could not seek employ on another vessel or offer his labour to another captain. The captains of the fishing fleet were all of one mould and one mind, and they conspired one with another to keep wages to a minimum. No one would pay Peppercorn any better than Grubb did, nor would he find better treatment under any other of the fishing captains. He was worthless, expendable, and Grubb pressed the point at every opportunity. The journey out was not so bad. There were jobs to do, but not so many once the nets were prepared. Peppercorn looked forward to the outward passage and would stand at the prow as the boat forged its path through the water, the lake's spray and the rising sun upon his face, and he would imagine the lands and people that might be found beyond the eastern horizon. And in those moments the world seemed a boundless and more promising place. Once they were a mile or so out on the lake, then would work begin, and all daydreams of wider worlds and better lives was forgotten in the urgency of the job at hand. Nets were dropped and drawn in turn. Silver fish that coiled first one way then the other were untangled from the nets, sorted into crates, and then began the gutting. Baldwin was particularly good at this, working deftly with a long, thin-bladed filleting knife that Grubb had given him for the purpose. And once the nets were all drawn and the crates filled, so began the race to be the first back to port, to unload their catch. Each crate weighed, and the excisemen paid a florin on the quarter hundredweight, leaving a trail of fish blood and guts in their wake, over which screeching seagulls fought and squabbled.